going to be fun this week, I think. So the title is The Clinician's New Clothes, and we're going to get into exactly why that's the title momentarily. But first, a disclaimer. This presentation is likely to provoke in you an emotional response, somewhere along the lines of hating me and wanting to throw rotten fruit at me. So I'm attempting to disarm your response immediately by just acknowledging that it will be the case. And so what I encourage you to do is not try to discount or ignore the material out of the gate just because you don't like it, but to critically appraise it. And you may at the end find that I'm wrong, and that's fine. But I hope that you would discount it on its intellectual and not its emotional response. So this is really the premise, which is a harsh premise, which is that the majority of the medical research you use on a daily basis is not accurate. And them is fighting words. So we'll get to exactly why I use these words specifically. But first, we have the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. That was a part of the reading material. Hopefully, I'm not going to rehash it. It was in your packet, so if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and read it tonight to your kids. It's great. But essentially, the premise of this presentation is I want to help you prevent intellectual nudity. In the story, the emperor walks around town obsessed with his new clothes, thinking that he's arrayed in the most beautiful garments because the magicians have tricked him, and he thinks that he's walking around these beautiful clothes when in fact he's wearing nothing on. To go back to that previous statement, I worry that sometimes in academic medicine we do the same thing. We array ourselves with these incredible, multi-center research studies. Oh, here's all the data for everything that I'm doing, when in fact it's actually a facade, and at times we've been tricked into it without even realizing it. So I'm just curious. I'm going to kind of just ask a quick poll. What percentage of the papers in pediatrics does the audience feel are trustworthy? So we'll start at 0%. And you raise your hands, I'll go up when you think that we've gotten to the percentage that you think are trustworthy. So we'll start at 10.
Wait, can we define trustworthy?
That's okay, fair enough. Trustworthy would be that you believe the results are accurate, and you're willing to use them in your clinical decision making.
Okay.
So I guess that would be the litmus test. Is good to use it for you to see. So 10%, 20%, 30%. 40%, 50%, 60%, 70, 80. Anyone think they're all good? All right. Dr. Tinkler's shaking his head no in the back. So you're right. Survey results, depending on the field, are somewhere in the 50%-ish range. So we're going to start by watching this video to show you that I'm just not making this all up. This comes from Nature, and the Scientific American made this video, and it's going to kind of highlight, in general terms, what I want to cover today.
Is there a reproducibility crisis in science? Nature asked 1,500 researchers this question as part of an online survey. Half agreed there's a significant crisis, and many more identified a slight crisis. Science moves forward through corroboration, when researchers verify others' results. But 70% of researchers who took our survey said they tried and failed to reproduce another group's experiment. And even when trying to reproduce their own work, just over half said they couldn't. Does this mean that most published research is wrong? Our respondents don't think so. Most still trust published results in their field, with physicists and chemists the most confident. There are many reasons why researchers may fail to reproduce results. Sometimes a small difference like shaking or stirring a sample can lead to different outcomes. But the biggest reason, according to our survey, is selective reporting. Things like cherry-picking data to support a pet hypothesis. To get to grips with reproducibility, we need better mentorship, proper use of statistics, and more robust experimental design. All these approaches got ringing endorsements in our survey. Whether it's a crisis or not, right now lots of people are paying attention to reproducibility. That makes it a good time for everyone, funders, publishers, scientists, and the institutions they work for, to act. We Read more and delve into the survey data at nature.com/news.
So if at the end of this you want to know more, that Nature website on the reproducibility process is actually excellent. They have great introductory statistics modules and the literature, and it's something that I actually use quite a bit in the creation of this presentation. So here, in addition to that video, here's some other statistics that I found in my research. So 1/3 of all published studies never get cited in anything else. 50% of all NIH-funded research, and I quote that because if any research ought to be quoted and published, it would be that, given the expense, the government standing, but only about 50% have published results 30 months from trial completion. That does go up to about 70% over lifetime of eventual publication. Like we just heard in Nature, 50% of researchers fail to produce their own results, 70% of colleagues' results based off of the Nature survey. And then in a recent study, preclinical cancer studies, only 11% have reproducible results. Now that's not clinical cancer studies, that's biological preclinical results. So the question is, why is this the case? We think of science as kind of this monolith that we just trust. Some people have even argued that science is the new religion and that we just believe what it tells us. But the survey results in that video we just watched seem to claim otherwise. So for those of you who came to have some fun with statistics, this is the statistical part that's going to be fun. So we're all familiar with p-values and the idea of significance. I'm going to challenge that just a little bit. So we have 101 rocks here, and hidden inside of these rocks there's a diamond. And you have a diamond detector, and it has a 99% deliverability guarantee. So we're going to go ahead and scan the rock, and the detector goes off. What is the likelihood that there's a diamond inside? It's not a trick. I will trick you at the end, but I'm not tricking you at the start. There's 99% chance, right? That's our sensitivity there. And when you know, there's a diamond. But we're scanning 101 rocks. So we've got another, the detector goes off again. What's the chance that this is a diamond? I'm still not tricking you. It's still 99%. But because we're scanning 101 rocks, for that 100, the detector is going to actually go off twice. Once for a positive result, where you find the diamond, and once for a negative result, which was a false positive. So if we're looking at p-values, we're looking at each individual scan of the rock. So it's a 99% chance there's a diamond. If we compare the relative outcomes of the detector going off as our baseline, it's actually a 50-50 chance that that was a positive finding or a positive result. What you're looking at here is a very simplified, and I'm not a statistician, but a very simplified overview of Bayesian versus frequentist statistics. And what I'm going to go into is why both of those are going to be helpful in medicine. They're used to a limited extent, but I'm going to argue that they ought to be used more frequently. So I love history, so we're going to talk about Jacob Bernoulli, who invented the bell curves. Invented is a generous word. Somewhat discovered, at least developed the idea of bell curves. He was helped by Ronald Fisher, who ended up coming with the idea of a p-value. As an aside, the p-value was never intended to be used as if we use it today. It was actually intended to be used as a check to see if it was worth doing further research in that area to figure out if something was significant or not. It was never intended to be the final test of significance. But he got into a battle with some other people, and we got what we got. Thomas Bayes is the other guy that we're going to talk about, and he came up with Bayesian statistics. So you've discussed this ad nauseum. This is the bell curve. This is the p-value. So to very briefly summarize, the p-value, we look at a significance of 0.05, which means that if I were, what are the chances that this result that I found could have just happened randomly? And we have arbitrarily assigned that a p-value of 0.05 or a 5% chance that this could have happened at random means that, well, we're pretty sure that it's actually something significant. So you're very familiar with that. What you're not as familiar with is Bayesian statistics. Bayesian statistics is much more complicated and wasn't used for a long time, largely because of the complexity and the mathematical computations required to implement. And I cannot do Bayesian statistics, don't ask me to, but here is how it is calculated. So it is a combination of the likelihood, the prior, and the marginal. What these things mean are how many times did you have to do the study in order to get the positive results? What was the likelihood, which is, in our terms, the pretest probability that you're actually going to find a positive result? And then the marginal is, as we assess this new evidence, does that change what we know? All of that is calculated into the posterior. So what you can see here in the graph is that what you end up with is you have your expectations, you have your reality, and the estimate. And you're putting all the estimate and the expectation together to figure out what the reality is. So again, to summarize, we're all familiar with frequentist, which is the null hypothesis. What the null hypothesis says is that I give you a placebo, and my hypothesis is that it's not going to make a difference, that what I'm doing doesn't matter at all. And then if you find a p-value of significance, what you're saying is I reject the null hypothesis. And in rejecting the null hypothesis, then logically whatever is left is true, so therefore my finding is legitimate. What that means, though, is that the p-value actually leans towards positive results. You cannot have something that proves the null hypothesis with frequency statistics. You can only reject the null hypothesis. Now, we say when you have a p-value that's non-significant that we will sometimes say that it favors the null hypothesis, but it doesn't actually. From a statistical and mathematical standpoint, you can only disprove the null hypothesis. The values of Bayesian statistics is a little bit different. The result is an odds ratio. Odds ratios have positive, and it's not negative in the sense that it's numerically negative, but negative being less than 1 means favoring the null hypothesis, and a variety of strengths therein. So at the end of your Bayesian analysis, you can say, I'm pretty sure that my research is legit, it really didn't make any difference, or actually it was a bad idea, and I should have just stuck with not doing anything. And so you can see that difference there. This is kind of the most crucial side, or most crucial slide of the statistical analysis part. So it's complicated. I'm going to break it down. What this is these are some guys that really are pushing to have Bayesian analysis be included in how we do medical research. And we're going to get there as to why that's the case. But what they've done is they have run a mathematical model to determine when our tests for p-value significance and the Bayesian agree and when they disagree, and what are some of the scenarios where they differ. The reason that's important is they look at the medical device industry. So Bayesian analysis is really not being used at all that I know of in medical literature and research. What it is being used for is the medical device industry. And it's been for a couple decades now kind of a big part of their statistical analysis. But so they're taking that and they're applying it to drug studies in this case. So in order to get a medication approved by the FDA, you have to have 2 separate studies asking the same question with a p-value significance of 0.05. So what this guy did, and I think he's Swedish, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name. What he did is he ran a mathematical model to say, okay, so you got that. You got 2 statistically significant studies asking the same question. What's the chance that that's actually not true? So we're going to look at these graphs. Now, let me take a minute to explain them first. So the graph on the left shows an effect size of 0.0. So very small to null effect, but 2 statistically significant p-values in these studies. The graph on the right has an effect size of 0.5. And in their paper, they claim that if you look at medical literature, the effect size is very rarely larger than 0.5. They also ran a third trial, which was the 0.2. It's exactly in the middle of the 2, so I'm just going to present the 0.0 and the 0.5. Also, what you have here is each of these graphs is the number of trials it took in order to get the 2 significant p-values. So in box number here with the 2, you ran 2 trials, both of them were significant. In this box here, you ran 20 trials, and 18 of them did not have significance, but 2 of them did. And the same here with the 0.5 effect size, you got 2 for 2, and you got 2 for 20. So that's how these graphs are laid out. Now, the color bars are set up in this way. A Bayes factor, which is an odds ratio of greater than 20, is considered strong evidence in favor of your testing. That's blue. Green is a Bayes factor between 3 and 20. That's considered mild evidence for your findings. A Bayes factor between 1 and 3 is considered essentially null. And of course, if it's less than 1, then that is black, and that is inverse. So you're actually favoring the null hypothesis. So with that explanation, let's look at these graphs. So if your effect size is 0.0, and let's look at actually the 0.5 first. So you have a pretty good effect size. You really found something here. You ran 2 trials, both of them were significant. Almost everything's blue. So the Bayes factor says that you were right. You know, you found these two statistically significant studies. Great job. And even when you're running 20 studies, only 2 of which are significant, and really if you look at the number of trials, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 20, really almost all of the values are blue. So because of the size of the effect size, almost then regardless of the number of trials that you're doing, because you have these 2 positive findings, the Bayes factor would say that it is true. Now if you bring the effect size down to 0.0, look how it changes though. You're running 2 trials, both of which are significant. Depending on this, this is the N per trial. This graph is very complicated, but essentially you're looking at 50%-ish is considered strong, and only about 50% is considered a mild Bayes factor, and that's 2 for 2. If you look at you ran 20 trials and you only had 2 of them be positive, almost everything actually favors the null hypothesis. Now, the reason this is important is because we're going to return to this later, but when we cite medical research, most of the time, the only thing we look at is the p-value. The author makes a claim, we look and see what the p-value is. Oh, the p-value is significant? Great. That means they found something. And that is not, what this shows is that that is not necessarily the case. You can have a lot of studies that have statistical significance, but not actually be in favor of what you want, of what you think they're in favor of. So Nietzsche famous says the p-value is dead. Nietzsche did say that. And
everything else was dead.
Everything else is dead, not the p-value. And the p-value is not dead. The p-value absolutely has its place in statistical analysis. What I want to challenge you on is that it's a little bit one-sided and lopsided, and we'll return to that later. But that you have to be really careful when you're using it for your interpretation. And using multivariate analysis will help you keep from getting tricked into things. So I would argue it's just more of a fragile handle with chaos. It's not dead. Dr. Keyes?
I'll just go back to the previous slide, just make sure I understood. So we were going across to the right, you're increasing the size, that's what you're saying.
That's correct. Within each of these 5 bars, you're increasing the N per group.
Can you go more to the effect size?
Exactly. So the effect size is just how far away your findings were from how far away from the standard deviation they were. So the greater the effect size, the larger the magnitude of the finding. It would be unusual to have an effect size of 0.0. Obviously, that's the smallest you can have, but it's a theoretical study. But let's say you had a 0.005 effect size approaching 0. You could have statistical significance showing that, but the question is, does that really mean anything? And the Bayes factor helps you determine some of that meaning of the p-value. Because as we discussed, the p-value really leans towards positive results. The Bayes factor is a little bit more neutral in that sense. All right. This is the next part of the talk. So the first part is on the statistical analysis. The second part is more on the fraud aspect of it. So what's in the question? So the NIH asked the study, and they said, how many of you guys have done bad stuff in your research? And about 33% of them agreed that they had done some of the top 10 questionable behaviors. 16% of them agreed that they changed the study design, methodology, or something. 0.3% admitted to just outright falsification of the data. There's another meta-analysis from 1970 to 2008 that they asked, how many of you have fabricated your data? And 2% of them said, yeah, I just made it up. 34% said, well, I didn't make it up, but I didn't do, what I was supposed to do. Then they said, okay, fine, we know that you're a good person, you're a good researcher, but your buddy in the lab, how often did they do these things? And the numbers changed to 14% of them were totally making up the data, and 72% of them were engaging in less serious practices, which would be p-hacking, cherry-picking your results, cherry-picking your data in order to manipulate the results. So that's pretty significant. So maybe when we have our kids, we shouldn't ask them if they did something wrong. We should ask their siblings if they think they're doing something wrong. Maybe that's the result. So hopefully I've saved enough time for the examples. So in the packet that I sent you was, of course, the Swedish story, The Emperor's New Clothes, or the Swedish translation. And there were 3 articles. it's probably obvious which ones have been redacted because there's a giant redaction printed across the front of every single page. But what we're going to do now is just kind of split it up. I think you all got packets. I have some more of each of them. I would just ask your table to get together and pick one of the three to discuss. One is from the New England Journal of Medicine. It's the original study showing that penicillin prophylaxis in kids with sickle cell disease is a good thing. Or is it? The next one is obviously redacted. It's the effect of Rampamil on walking times. And then the final one is by the Dr. Wakefield, that we all know and love, who showed, theoretically, that vaccines cause autism. And this is the original paper that he published in The Lancet. So what I'll ask you to do is to pick amongst your table which paper you want to go over. Take a minute. The highlighted sections I think are the most salient, but that was really just to save you time in reading. Some of really all of the papers are good, and just see what you think are the strengths of each study, the weaknesses of the study, and if you just encountered this study in the press, would you believe it? Would it have affected your clinical decision making? And then we'll go from there. Bring us back together now.
But that you could look at it and say, is that evaluation absolute? That's right.
So we'll start with the study that I have hailed as the good study. Side note, I had no idea Dr. Dunsmore was actually involved in this study. It came about because I Googled...
Only personally involved, only if being a fellow in the center is
She was acknowledging she was just a fellow in the center, but I had no idea of that. I just Googled the most influential papers in pediatrics ever, and this was on the list. So I've hailed this as a good paper. That doesn't mean it's perfect.
not perfect.
It's pretty darn good. Does anyone want to comment on the things that they did really well, or the things that were almost perfect but not quite?
And I won't say anything.
So it's multi-center, double-blinded, large N. All these things are very nice.
So it's double-blinded, multi-centered, large N, University of
Some of the things that we were discussing they did not do well was at that particular time the study was going on, the pneumococcal vaccine got expanded, and they just kind of said, well, maybe that had something to do with it or not. Another thing that was we brought to our attention is the p-value is ridiculously good, where it's almost suspiciously good. It's like non-existent. So with it like 0.0025, yeah, which is almost like it's just exceptionally good to, like I said, the point where it might be, how in the world did you get results that well? Just a couple little things. But overall, the study showed so much promise that they stopped it early because the placebo group was getting hurt. So.
Anyone else like to keep?
I'm struck because this is such a foundational article, and he talked about the large sample size. This is a multi-center study. I'm frankly a little surprised that the sample sizes are not bigger, based on what you just had a while ago about the effective sample size. And there's a whole paragraph in here that's a little above my pay grade, and understanding about when they stopped it. The study, the statistical thought behind that, and if they had continued it, it would probably reach this, and that was a little bit hard for me to understand.
It's above my pay grade. Yeah, I'm not sure.
They were worried about more deaths.
Oh, I understand. Yeah.
Statistically, because of the amount of time that we had, and you had the many deaths, or you had the many septicemia, if you continued it to the outset of the trial that was planned, then X number of deaths or septicemia would occur, which would have been harmful for the patients who were involved.
But they mentioned the power in there too, and the power is one of the other concepts that.
Yeah. Absolutely. We won't spend too much time on this one because it's too good to talk about. The next one's just too much fun. We got to leave time for Dr. Wakefield. But so some things with this study, exactly what Dr. Hayes mentioned, I think those are all great. Really my only qualm would be the two things. One, the vaccine got introduced. Yay for treating people. Bummer for, the perfect study. But that's just life. Stuff comes up. And I felt like they did a really nice job explaining how they tried to mediate the effects of that being introduced and how they gave it to everyone. And ultimately, I think we can agree it probably didn't change the study results at all. But I appreciate that they also just acknowledged that. One thing that this paper does exceptionally well is every little thing that could have gone wrong, they have a paragraph explaining what happened, their thoughts about it, why they did what they did, and how to move forward from that and how it could have affected things. Like Dr. Keys mentioned, the study was stopped 8 months early. From a intellectual purity standpoint, you don't want to do that because you want to know exactly what it shows, and maybe at month, with 7 months left, the whole study would have changed, and everyone gets septicemia. But the likelihood of that happening is essentially null, and then it comes down to an ethics thing. And I think they made the appropriate choice, which is this is really helping a lot of kids. We should implement this sooner than we had intended to, even though it violates a little bit of our intellectual purity of the study. I think they made the right call, but that's just an individual decision you have to make. But overall, I would herald this as an exceptional study and one that was done very well. The next, the bad. Sorry, Dr. Wakefield. I will cite Dr. Rasuli in the back, who asked me if I had handed out the paper for the vaccine study, because is this thing even related to vaccines? What happened here? So does anyone want to comment on this one? When I pulled it up online, I was like, that's not the paper I'm looking for. And then I had to read it to figure out it actually was.
Well, we had a really hard time identifying what the outcome measures was, just like point blank, and what the exposures were. There's a lot of hand waving, but those two very fundamental questions are just not even addressed. And then I'm glad you put that image up there, because it, who are the controls, where did you get them from, where, why? Yeah, we had a lot of questions.
I also have a lot of questions. Does anyone else want to bring up some questions?
Small sample size.
Very small. It is 12.
Like minuscule.
So, yep,
Right.
that's pretty small.
So they were cherry picking their case, this case study. So they were looking for patients with autistic regression and GI symptoms, and they also appeared to be lumping all of the pathology findings under the same umbrella when the article says that a range of pathology findings were found. So I had some concerns about that, as well as the fact that there are 3 patients with what looks like MMA levels that overlap with controls.
Exactly. And who are these mythical controls and where can they be found? And your point about the cherry picking is excellent. So the inclusion criteria in the study, to answer your question, is your doctor or your parents just felt like maybe these things were related. That brought you in the study. Yes. But you also had to have autism and had to have had regression in order to get in the study. So it just doesn't make sense. Anyone else have any comments they want to bring up? So part of the reason I include this in the paper is so that you are all familiar with, because unfortunately we deal with the repercussions of this paper every single day. This is not the only paper that talks about vaccines being bad and, giving you the cooties, but it is one of the big ones that started all this. And so I want you to be familiar with it so that if you have a patient, because sometimes we have the irrational patient that comes to us who wants to ignore all vaccines, but sometimes they're highly educated people who have some legitimate questions. I want you to be familiar with this paper so that you can discount those things and talk about how this study was actually terrible and really bad. So here's the official redaction statement. It basically says, exactly like Dr. Doherty's point, they were consecutively referred, and that who is this local ethics committee, and actually they never approved it, he just kind of said that they did. So the Lancet ended up redacting it. Interestingly, the redaction was related not so much to the results, but actually to the discussion section. And I highlighted the first sentence of the discussion section, which is just fascinating because he says, basically, we did all these things and we found this intestinal hyperplasia and, it probably causes autism, with extremely little intellectual linking between those things. And then he spent several paragraphs saying, because of all these findings that we have, that shows that there's probably a link between the MMR vaccine and autism, and then he tries to cover himself in the very last paragraph where he said we did not approve an association with the MMR vaccine, but there's more biological studies underway, which goes against everything he just spent several paragraphs trying to endorse. So this is a bad study. Side note, from an ethical standpoint, we'll hit this a little bit more. He had invented a competing MMR vaccine, and he was likely using this study to discount the original MMR vaccine to increase sales of his personally developed one. Dudley, who wants to comment on this study? This is, it's from the adult literature, so I know we try to avoid that whenever possible. Did anyone read this? No? Yeah?
I took a glance and I just kind of have a question about it. So it seemed to you like the exclusion criteria was a little aggressive, especially for a disease where like patients that are dealing with different alcohol. It doesn't seem like it represents.
Yep. It's a pretty strict exclusion criteria. But what do you think of their methods? Do you think they're pretty good? I mean, that's more of a little quibble. They're being too strict about kicking people out. What would you feel about overall? It's pretty good, right? I don't know if any of you guys encountered this article, but it's pretty amazing. They go through, they list almost everything that they're doing. They talk about their inclusion criteria, their exclusion, intention to treat. It's a big multi-centered study. They talk about their outcomes. All their p-values are less than 0.001, almost all of them. You guys know what's wrong with the study?
Made it all up.
They made it up. Not all of it was made up, but the researcher admitted to making up enough of the data to influence the results, and so the study has since been redacted. Here's the official. It was published in JAMA. I almost included another set of several articles by the editor-in-chief in JAMA, who has since been removed from his post for fabricating the majority of his research as well. His was in the social sciences, and I think we like to sometimes make fun of the softer sciences because we say it's easier to fabricate those results. So I wanted to give you guys, the gold standard randomized controlled trial and shows that those go wrong too. But these are not just like little journals from the middle of nowhere that are publishing false data. I mean, the journals that you are reading and using have an element of this. And we're going to talk about, in the closing aspect of this presentation, how to avoid that. So, also, I love cartoons. If you guys are not familiar with the XKCD cartoons, they're very nerdy, and they're wonderful. All right, so why does this happen? Well, tenure, promotion, advancement, all this is tied to publication, not to research. So if you getting a raise and you getting tenure is related to you being published, well, it's not sexy to really publish studies that have already been done before, and it's certainly not sexy to publish something saying that your colleague was wrong. There are numbers out there, which I'm not going to include, that talk about how often that happens, and it does actually happen more than you might think. Those types of studies do get published, but by and large, the funding is not going to trying to reproduce positive findings. It's going towards new things, and we see that across all different fields. Why would you make something up, like Dr. I think it's Anaximus? You want money, you want personal ambition. She got it published in JAMA. Obviously, the financial incentive, and then there's the less insidious. There's what's called the wallpaper effect. So, which is a joke to say that the wallpaper of the room where the study was done affects the results, meaning that your subconscious bias and how you are looking at things is going to affect the results to a certain extent. We talked about how statistical models are bent towards positive findings. And then finally, we run really complex studies with really complex variables. I mean, the penicillin vaccine came out in the middle of that study. And so how do we incorporate that? And how do we look at that? So how to avoid this? We're going to summarize and kind of distill all the things we've talked about today. So you want to find multiple good articles asking the same question. Those Bayes factor slides that I showed earlier, they didn't even talk about if you only had one study showing a p-value of 0.05. That was 2 studies that were asking the same question. So you want to have multiple articles asking the same thing. Evidence is great, but expert opinion is also great. There's a lot of literature to talk about that as well. So use your heads. Use evidence-based medicine and expert opinion together when things seem to not make sense. are going to learn through journal clubs, critically read and appraise research, of course. You want to maintain awareness of the bias. You're going to look for larger effect sizes, not just statistical significance. The combination of those things that really show you that there's a winner. High-powered multi-center trials. We want to use varied statistical analysis methods so that one individual analysis method doesn't lead us astray. And then, of course, the ethics that I love is finding ways to tie tenure and advancement to research, not necessarily to just publications, which are heavily bent towards positive findings. You're going to be a healthy skeptic and create an environment where there's an acceptance of proving the null hypothesis and rejecting your findings, which is not fun. So 5 points, expert opinion and EBM when making clinical decisions, multiple statistically significant studies with good effect sizes to feel confident that you're not just seeing noise, research both supporting and refuting the null hypothesis, make sure your colleagues are doing the right thing, and make sure you're doing the right thing, even when no one's looking. And then finally, just don't get paralyzed. It can be overwhelming to say, well, how do I make sure all my results are reproducible? And what can I trust? You just made me doubt everything that I've ever known about academic medicine. Well, I don't want that to be the case either. Ultimately, you make the best decisions with what you've got. And I would just encourage you to be intellectually rigorous when making those decisions. One thing that I fall victim to is when we're on the wards and we want to make clinical decisions. It's very easy to say, I want to do this. Can we find a research article that supports that? And we go to the literature and we find one article. We find that it has a 0.05 statistical significance. And I will very frequently say, like, okay, well, that validates my thoughts that this would be a good thinking process. But really, just finding that one article with a positive statistical significance is not validating my question. It's really not even worth doing. I should go and find multiple articles with the effect sizes, with the statistical significance, or just base my decision-making off of my clinical judgment, but not try to be intellectually dishonest and back myself up with this backing up that is really probably just statistical noise. Now, meta-analysis, all these things are different, and I'm not talking about that attempt to help the clinician with some of these quandaries that we face with individual studies. Then a sobering reminder about statistics to close. I was going to ask, do you guys know who this is?
Apparently
it's Sally Clark. Do you guys know what Sally Clark went to jail for? So Sally Clark was a British lady, and she was sentenced to life in prison for murdering her 2 children, about 6 months apart. One died, and then about 6 months later, the next died. And what sent her to prison was a statistician witnessed on the stand that the statistical odds of 2 children dying from SIDS in that period of time was 1 in 73 million. And the jury ruled that that was so unlikely that could ever have occurred that they sent her to prison. The real odds were calculated later, about 3.5 years later, and determined to be about 1 in 297,000. The statistical odds of murdering 2 children, looking at the population rates for murder in that same period of time, turned out to be 1 in 2.7 million, which is actually an odds ratio of 9 to 1 against her murdering her 2 children and it being related to SIDS. And so it was overturned. She did end up spending 3.5 years in prison, and as a result of that, died of alcohol intoxication because her life was destroyed. So just a sobering reminder, and I use this to say,
That's not funny.
oh, sorry, I didn't even,
Oh, no.
Didn't think that through. Anyway, I use this to say, we like numbers. Numbers make us feel comfortable. So patients will ask you, what are my odds of getting this? What are my chances that I'm going to die from that? I would encourage you to be very careful when throwing out numbers because people will make decisions based off of those things. They say that 90% of statistics are made up on the spot, and we are definitely guilty of that in our, I just made that up, in our everyday practice. And so just be very careful when you're using numbers. Make sure you're using them in an intellectually honest way. So data is powerful. The right hand is a tool, and the wrong hand is a weapon. So thanks for listening. Today is also my wedding anniversary, so I'll just say thanks to my wife and my 8-month-old kid. And then, again, I love graphs, so extrapolating, that's funny. All right, question, Dr. Dunbar.
I guess a comment. So it's also the way that we understand science is constantly changing, and the way that it interprets things are constantly changing. And I will say that we see through a glass darkly most times when we're doing any kind of clinical trial studies or experimentation, and I would bring up the most recent thing, which is the multi-analysis that was done on red meat and whether it actually causes problems with cardiovascular disease or cancer, which has been the dogma for at least 2 decades. And now the idea that really has been borne out by multiple studies across multiple different types of cultures. So I would say that even when you're doing the best you can, you sometimes can't hang your hat on it because the understanding is that we have a contemporary. And I have a retraction. This study was Props 1 study. I didn't have anything to do with that one. Props 2 is the one that I was, so I want to be intellectually honest and say that this is Props 1 and I was not there for Props 1.
Oh, wow. John Ioannidis is a researcher who's famous for saying that most published science is crap. And so I wondered when you were preparing this presentation if you had a chance to look at anything he'd published. Looking at more of his publications is on my to-do list whenever I get more free time.
That name doesn't sound familiar. I don't think I encountered it. But this is a topic that I find very interesting. And so I've actually write his name down. Yeah, I'd like to.
We'll review his works another time.
Yeah, sounds fun. Any other comments, questions?
Yeah, I can just yell. The people in the phone, let's yell. Oh, okay. So you mentioned publication bias, positive results are more likely to get published, and that kind of puts pressure on people. I'm wondering if there's kind of a push towards getting more negative results published just for the sake of the field in general. And I partially ask this because I'm sitting on a bunch of negative data that I would love to get published.
That's an excellent question. To counter this, there is some literature that talks about that, and there's some good, I can try to find it for you. I just didn't have time to put it in here. But that is a more in vogue thing now, and the New England Journal, JAMA, they are accepting articles that either disprove existing research or disprove it. But still, it's hard to do. So I hope you can publish your negative results. But it is a difficult thing because we don't look at that as the way medicine and society progress, and yet sometimes if we're headed in the wrong direction, stopping our momentum in that direction is difficult.
Well, and especially for those top-of-the-line journals, New England Journal, JAMA, all of those, the bar to get your manuscript in there is incredibly high. And so they don't commonly take negative results and promote those. They have so many other options to do.
Anyone else have anything? All right. Well, thank you all. And if